The war in Ukraine has been a regular succession of momentum changes. At the start of the war, Russia was attacking with the aim of overwhelming Ukrainian defences with superior firepower. After Ukraine largely withstood the initial Russian pressure, preventing Putin's army from capturing key targets like Kyiv, Odessa and Kharkiv, the AFU retook the strategic initiative and pushed the undermanned Russian army out of the Kharkiv Oblast and the right bank of the Dnipro. After that, Ukraine once again went on the defensive to wait winter out, preserve its reserves, and hunker down until more Western supplies arrived, a period which lasted almost 7 months. Ukraine emerged out of this defensive phase with some territorial losses, but way less than what the Russians had hoped for. Now, this period also gave Russia the opportunity to create extensive minefields, formidable defensive structures, and a vast system of trenches and strongholds, particularly in the Zaporizhia Oblast, which looked like the most logical point of attack for the Ukrainian army. Ukraine has captured the strategic initiative once again and launched its long-anticipated counter-offensive on the Zaporizhia front and the Bakhmut section. In this video, we're going to talk about the Ukrainian counter-offensive, the successes it has achieved, the challenges it has encountered, and what we can realistically expect from it. Now, a lot of what we'll be talking about relates to specific pieces of gear and vehicles, and if any of this makes you want to upgrade your own stuff, you're in luck. We've got an announcement from our sponsor Ridge that they're teaming up with Hennessy for their 2023 Summer Sweepstakes, in which purchasing Ridge products enters you into a prize to win a custom Hennessy Ford Bronco, or if you prefer, you can take $75,000. Here's how it works. Enter without spending $1 on the website linked in the description. But then you also get another entry for every $1 you spend on Ridge products, and a load of bonus entries if you buy custom Hennessy partnered designs. That means now is the best time to upgrade your wallet to the robust and sleek Ridge wallet, in your choice of colours and with a 12-card capacity, or get your key situation under control with their equally stylish key case. Both are made of such high-quality materials that they come with a lifetime guarantee and free returns with full refunds within 99 days if you just want to try it out. Let's make it even better. Use our link in the description and our code Kings and Generals to get 10% off your purchase, and you get an extra 10 entries in the sweepstake for free. After getting some of the promised Western tanks, armoured vehicles and other crucial military supplies, Ukraine finally launched a counterattack on several axes on the Zaporizhia front on June 4th. Ukraine has been attacking on the Kamyanska axis in the west of the front, with arguably Vasilivka as an intermediate target and Melitopol as the final target. On the Orikhiv axis, with Tokmak as an intermediate target, with Melitopol and Berdyansk as options for the final target, and the Velika Novosilka axis, with Mariupol as the final target. All of these attacks serve the purpose of cutting the Russian land connection with Crimea. Liberation of any of Mariupol, Berdyansk or Melitopol would prevent Russia from supplying its forces in Crimea and on the right bank of the Dnipro, relying solely on the Kerch Bridge, which is currently heavily damaged following a naval drone attack by Ukraine. Moreover, if the Ukrainian army reaches those cities, the Kerch Bridge will be well within Storm Shadow range. It would make the complete destruction of this crucial supply line more realistic. Liberation of Melitopol, Berdyansk or Mariupol, accompanied by the destruction of the Kerch Bridge, would make Russian control over Crimea and the left bank of the Dnipro untenable. So the choice of the Ukrainian army to counterattack on the Zaporizhia front makes sense. On the other hand, this has been expected by the Russians, who have prepared formidable defensive structures on this front. Months of indecision by Ukraine's Western allies in the supply of tanks and armoured vehicles gave the Russian army enough time to build all those defensive fortifications, which are now proving very costly for the Ukrainian army. Initially, Ukrainian attacks on the Zaporizhia front employed a large number of tanks and armoured vehicles in an attempt to achieve a decisive breakthrough by employing maneuver warfare. But despite gaining some ground on the first few days of the counter-offensive, Ukraine also lost several tanks, including Leopard 2s and armoured vehicles, including Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. Russian propaganda was all too happy to disseminate images of destroyed or damaged Western tanks and vehicles, trying to create a perception that the Ukrainian counter-offensive had been a failure from day one. Dense minefields made maneuver warfare on the Zaporizhia Oblast impossible. During their training in Germany, a Ukrainian serviceman reportedly asked his German instructor about his recommendations and advice on minimizing the risk of Russian mines for the Ukrainian offensive. A German instructor advised him to simply bypass minefields. If only everything was that simple. Russian minefields are so dense that Ukrainians simply do not have an option to bypass minefields if they intend to advance. On the first days of the Ukrainian counter-offensive, several armored vehicles and tanks hit minefields, which was followed by Russian artillery strikes on these vehicles. As of July 19th, Ukrainian sources reported that the AFU had received only 15% of Western mine-clearing vehicles pledged by Ukraine's allies, which made Ukraine's mine-clearing operations slow, causing the whole offensive operation to slow down. Ukrainian commanders have already admitted this. In his interview with CNN on July 14th, the commander of the Ukrainian Tavriisk group of forces, currently engaged in fighting on the Zaporizhia front, Brigadier General Tanevsky, acknowledged that the counteroffensive has been slower than expected due to complex and dense minefields. Zelensky and several other top-level political and military officials of Ukraine have admitted a slow pace of the counteroffensive as well. Ukraine's lack of mobile air defences on the Zaporizhia front has also made their armoured units vulnerable to effective Ka-52 attack helicopters. Most of Ukraine's air defence systems are likely in the rear, defending big cities and strategic objects. This has allowed a relative freedom of operation for Ka-52s on the Zaporizhia front, causing casualties for Ukrainian forward units. So while the Ukrainian army liberated several villages and gained some ground in its initial attack, particularly in the Velika Novosilka axis, they also encountered painful losses. There would be cases when the Ukrainian units would capture Russian trenches only to be pushed out of them by the Russian artillery or by the second echelon Russian units. There have also been reports about Russians booby-trapping their abandoned trenches. Lastly, some Ukrainian sources complained of effective electronic warfare by the Russian army, which has presumably decreased the effectiveness of Ukraine's drone army. In the absence of modern fighter jets, Ukraine has excessive dependence on drones to maintain some sort of parity in the air and to conduct recon missions. Thus, problems encountered by the Ukrainian army on the first days of its counter-offensive demonstrated that the well-dug-in Russian forces had no intention of crumbling and allowing the Ukrainians a nice easy walk to the Azov Sea. Russian forces in the Zaporizhia Oblast are relatively fresh, since most of them did not take part in offensive operations of the taxing winter campaign from Russia. Ukraine lacks air superiority to offset some of the countermeasures offered by Russia, such as the heavy use of Ka-52 helicopters. The lack of air superiority, accompanied by dense minefields, has made quick-paced maneuver warfare, relying on rapid breakthroughs through defensive lines, impossible. Ukraine had to adapt its offensive strategy on the Zaporizhia front, and it did. At the beginning of the counter-offensive, the Ukrainian army employed only company-size assaults, with units bolstered by several tanks and armoured vehicles on Russian lines. And although some called these attacks probing, the losses were significant enough to force a new paradigm, and since the initial losses, the Ukrainian command has switched to a more patient tactic. They have prioritized targeting Russian artillery, MLRS, military bases, artillery and fuel depots, key bridges and supply lines. Destroying as many artillery systems as possible will decrease the Russian firepower on the Zaporizhia front in general, which will save many Ukrainian soldiers and their vehicles. Ukraine already enjoys a range advantage in artillery thanks to HIMARS, and if they could degrade short-range Russian artillery, Russian counterattacks against Ukrainian forward units will be less costly. The purpose of targeting fuel and ammunition depots, along with supply lines, is clear too. Just like in their autumn Kherson campaign, the Ukrainian command aims to create supply problems for the Russian army, which would make their presence in the occupied areas of Zaporizhia and Kherson oblasts untenable. As we have already mentioned, Ukraine has damaged the Kerch Bridge and the Chonhar Bridge in order to slow down Russian logistics. Attacks on fuel and ammunition depots are made for the same purpose. The Russian command has already admitted supply problems. The deputy commander of the 58th Combined Arms Army, currently fighting on the Zaporizhia front, General Ivan Popov, was dismissed on July 11th for complaining about the lack of Russian counter-battery activity and lack of reserves to substitute Russian units on the front line exhausted from regular Ukrainian assaults. This problem has probably only gotten worse since then. although the pace of the Ukrainian counteroffensive on the Zaporizhia front remains slow. Since changing their approach, the Ukrainian army has managed to reach, and according to some reports, pass the first line of anti-tank ditches and dragon teeth, the so-called Surovikin Line, southeast of Robotyne, following a minor breakthrough of Russian defensive lines. So far, since the start of the counteroffensive, Ukraine has liberated Lobkova and Pyatyatki on the Kamyanska axis. On the Orkiv axis, the AFU has broken through Russian lines east of Robotyne, advancing for about 10 to 15 kilometers. On the Velika Novosilka axis, on the administrative border of Zaporizhia and Donetsk oblasts, Ukraine has liberated Neskuchne, Storozheve, Blahodatne, Makirivka, Rivnopil, Novodorivka, Levadna, Staromayorska, and Urizhaina, among other areas. While these are all small villages, Ukraine is making gains, while suffering fewer losses than it did at the beginning of the counteroffensive on the Zaporizhia front. Most importantly, it is already fighting for the first Surovikin line of defense, and according to some unverified accounts, the AFU has actually crossed it near Vobova on the Orkiv axis. Ukraine's Western allies, the online supporters of Ukraine, and most importantly the Ukrainian people, would have hoped for more progress, but the Russian resistance has been stiffer than expected. Russia may start experiencing more supply and manpower problems on the Zaporizhia front in the foreseeable future, just like it did on the right bank of the Dnipro in the autumn of 2022, while the Ukrainian army will look for weaker points in Russian defenses, exhausted by non-stop defending, in order to break through there and send their armored units to capitalize on this breakthrough. Sources still report that the bulk of the Ukrainian force dedicated to the counteroffensive has still not engaged in the fighting, indicating that the Ukrainian command is waiting for an opportune moment to send them in. The Zaporizhia front will likely remain the main focus of the Ukraine counteroffensive, but fighting has been going on other fronts as well. On the Kherson front, which is closely linked with the Zaporizhia front, the tense stalemate continues. The destruction of the Kakhovka Dam on June 5th caused the flooding of the Dnipro Delta Islands, some of which were controlled by the Ukrainian army and the first line of Russian units. As the flooding gradually receded, Ukraine restarted deployment of small units to the left bank of the Dnipro, specifically to the area under the heavily HIMARSed Antonivsky Bridge. In late June, it was reported that the Ukrainians took this area, also known as Dachi, under its control. Even though it's not a bridgehead in the strict sense of the word, since the area is not suitable for the deployment of armored vehicles and a larger amount of military equipment due to a lack of road infrastructure and boggy terrain, the Ukrainian activity on the left bank has drawn the attention of Russian forces, who have been trying to dislodge the Ukrainian forces from this area. The problem for them is that the right bank of the Dnipro is on higher ground, and that any Russian movement towards Dachi has been met with heavy artillery fire from the right bank. At one point, the Russians even launched an Iskander missile at around 100 Ukrainian soldiers, but the structure of the Antonivsky Bridge has given them decent protection. Since then, the Ukrainians have also landed near Oleshki on the river Konka, the Dnipro tributary. Also, according to both Ukrainian and Russian sources, on August 8th, Ukrainian forces landed in Kozachyi Laheri. Russian sources claim that the Ukrainian unit in Kozachyi Laheri was forced to retreat, but Ukrainian sources report that they've been able to push the Russian battalion out of Kozachyi Laheri and establish their positions in the village. If the AFU really manages to establish firm control over Kozachyi Laheri, it has the potential to serve as a bridgehead for the Ukrainian army. The T-2206 highway is nearby, and it will allow the deployed Ukrainian forces to advance further towards the Kherson Oblast or the Zaporizhia Oblast if they indeed manage to establish a bridgehead there, which is an extremely difficult mission. But even if they do not, the persistent activity of the Ukrainian army on the left bank of the Dnipro has prevented the Russian army from redeploying its reserves to the Zaporizhia front. Therefore, the AFU will continue its activity on the left bank in order to fix the Russian forces. In the best case scenario, Ukraine will look to establish a bridgehead there and develop its success towards Crimea or the Zaporizhia Oblast. The Bakhmut section of the front is another part of the battlefield where Ukraine is counterattacking. The strategic importance of Bakhmut in purely military terms is limited at this phase of the war. Bakhmut is an important logistical intersection in Donbass on the way to other important cities and towns like Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Severodonetsk, Polivka and Donetsk, but is still far away from each of them. Capturing Bakhmut does not ensure control over any of these cities, but it is an important stepping stone for further advance for both sides. Evidently, the Russian army was exhausted from months of heavy fighting in the Bakhmut section, and did not have the offensive potential to continue their advance on Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. Hence, they have been on the defensive ever since they captured Bakhmut. Now, even if the AFU manages to liberate Bakhmut, would they have sufficient offensive potential remaining to push on Holivka and Donetsk, the areas which are heavily fortified? We do not know, but few predict the liberation of Donetsk as the immediate strategic goal of the Ukrainian army. It will be a huge task to break through heavily fortified lines near the city of Donetsk, the success of which is not a given, similar to the situation on the Zaporizhia front. Therefore, at this point, Ukraine's counter-offensive on Bakhmut mostly seems to serve the purpose of liberating further land, along with targeting the morale of the Russian public. The loss of Bakhmut would be a major propaganda defeat for the Kremlin. After all, the capture of Bakhmut has been likened to the Battle of Berlin by Russian propaganda. So far, Ukraine has mostly been using Soviet-era tanks and armoured vehicles in the Bakhmut section, which may indicate that this is not the primary target of the Ukrainian army, as Western tanks and armoured vehicles and Storm Shadow long-range missiles are mostly used on the Zaporizhia front. The AFU started counter-offensive operations in the Bakhmut section in May and has been focusing on the northern and southern flanks of Bakhmut. They have been advancing around Dubovo-Vasilivka, Barkivka and Yehidna in the north, and around Klishchiivka and Kurdyumivka in the south. In the north, Dubovo-Vasilivka is on elevated ground, making it a logical target. Liberation of Barkivka and Yehidna would allow the Ukrainian army to take control of a portion of the TO513 highway to the north of Bakhmut, one of the key supply lines to the city. It would also put Russian control over areas like Krasnohora and Soledar at risk. In the south, the Ukrainian army has already taken key heights around Klishchiivka and Kurdyumivka, and has claimed to liberate Andriivka. All of these villages are on the TO513 highway, and control over them would cut the Russian supply line from Bakhmut to the south. However, even the loss of all the aforementioned areas would not mean the complete cut of supplies to the Russian forces inside Bakhmut, due to the existence of supply lines coming from the east, which is currently controlled by the Russian army. But control over high ground, both to the north and the south of Bakhmut, would put the Russian positions inside the city under Ukrainian fire control. At this point, the intermediate target of the AFU in this section is to take the supply lines to the north and the south of the city under their control. The final targets are presumably the liberation of Bakhmut and areas to the north like Soledar, basically negating all the gains the Russians made in their most recent offensive. After that, the Ukrainian grouping in Donbass would presumably need an operational pause. Of course, the future of operations on the Donbass front will also depend on Ukraine's successes elsewhere, particularly in Zaporizhia. For the time being, the Ukrainian army has been able to take advantage of the exhaustion of Russian forces in the Bakhmut section after months of heavy fighting, along with the withdrawal of Wagner from Ukraine. Kyiv's prospects in this section look promising in the short and mid-term, but the continuation of advance towards Donetsk seems unlikely at this point. Even though Ukraine is counterattacking as we speak, the Russian army does not intend to fully give the strategic initiative to the AFU on a platter. The Russians are attacking on the Svatova-Kreminna line, presumably to force the Ukrainians to deploy forces to the Luhansk Oblast, which would mean the weakening of Ukraine's offensive potential elsewhere, specifically in the Zaporizhia Oblast. Since July, Russia has made notable progress in the Serebryansky forest area towards Toska, and have crossed the Zherebets River, contesting Serhiivka, Nadia, and Novoihorivka, along with advancing towards Novoselivska and Kupiansk. Further advance of the Russian army on this front would be extremely taxing. Ukraine is holding higher ground to the west of the river Oskil, another natural barrier the Russians would have to cross if they intend to threaten Izium and Kharkiv. At this point, it looks highly unlikely, as the Ukrainians have managed to stabilize their lines towards the end of July. The most probable goal of the Russian command on this front is to fix as many Ukrainian units as possible. Therefore, at this point, the Svatova-Kreminna line seems like a secondary front. Ukraine's gains since the start of its counter-offensive have been modest. They have changed their tactics to preserve more Western-donated tanks and armoured vehicles, and of course manpower, in the face of heavily fortified defensive lines and dense minefields. The Ukrainian army is targeting key supply lines to the Zaporizhia Oblast, destroying Russian artillery, ammunition and fuel depots, while conducting small-scale infantry assaults supported by 2 to 3 tanks or armoured vehicles. This tactic aims to weaken Russian military potential in the area and to exhaust its forces on the front line. If Ukraine manages a proper breakthrough in the area, the Ukrainian army may take advantage of the flat terrain of the Zaporizhia Oblast and send its tanks to engage in maneuver warfare and advance as deeply as possible. For now, the Russian defences are standing, but the reported lack of reserves may come back to haunt them in the foreseeable future. The real game changer in this area would be the Ukrainian offensive across the Dnipro River. If the AFU succeeds in creating a bridgehead, it would mean a second front in the west for Russian units in the Zaporizhia Oblast, which would also likely overstretch their lines. But creating such a bridgehead would be extremely complicated, so at this point this prospect appears unlikely. Many think that Ukraine has a window until the rainy season starts, sometime in October or November, to liberate as much ground as possible in order to give another impetus to its Western allies and demonstrate to the world once again that they are capable of defeating the Russian army. At this point, the biggest enemy of Ukraine is the Russian army, but the so-called Ukraine fatigue of its Western allies is not far behind. The Ukrainian government has been brushing aside this opinion publicly, but probably understands that they have to make significant gains on the Zaporizhia front to keep the Western support coming. According to the Oryx blog, Ukraine has lost 14 Leopard 2 tanks of different modifications, 49 Bradley armoured fighting vehicles, 4 AMX-10 armoured fighting vehicles, and 2 CV-90 infantry fighting vehicles, among other losses since the start of the counter-offensive. While these losses are painful, it has to be noted that most of them were lost on the first days of the counter-offensive. Since the Ukrainian command changed the offensive tactic, the losses have decreased. They are also being mitigated by more pledges of armoured vehicles from the west. The Ukrainian army is attempting extremely complicated offensive operations with a near parity of manpower, without any air superiority, against a solidly dug-in enemy, which does not intend to run away. Losses are inevitable. Both Zelensky and Zaluzhny have acknowledged slower than expected progress and have urged everyone to be patient, because every day, every meter is given by blood. More videos on the war in Ukraine are on the way, so make sure you have subscribed and pressed the bell button. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive videos. Join the ranks of patrons and YouTube members via the link in the description or by pressing the button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, join our private Discord, and much more. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing, it helps immensely. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.